All right, good morning, everybody. Hey, glad that you're here today. I'm really glad you're here today. Like after the last couple weeks, I wasn't sure if y'all were going to come back or not. You know, I mean, it was pretty thin in here with the weather and stuff, but I'm glad that you are here, especially if this is your first time with us, if you're our guest here today. We are glad that you're here, glad that you're watching online. Welcome to you all. If you wouldn't mind doing me a favor, if you're watching us online, if you would just like put something in the comments just so we're trying to get an idea of how many people actually watch this, or if right now I'm just talking to myself. So I'd really like to know the situation there. You see a thing up there, screen time. This is going to be a little sermon series I'm going to start after this one is over, beginning February 23rd. We're just going to kind of take a biblical look at this idea of technology and screens and different things like that. So I really want to encourage you to be here for that. But we're continuing this morning in this series on the Sermon on the Mount. And I was reading this past week some research by a guy named George Stratton. It was done way back in the 1800s, but he wanted to do some experiments on perception and how people see things. And specifically, he wanted to see if he could change the way that we physically see the world. And so here's what he did. He created these lenses so that if you look through these lenses, everything would be sort of inverted. Everything would be upside down. And so if you think about that for a moment, it's kind of weird. The clouds are down here and the trees are up there, the trees are hanging down, and you pour your coffee and it goes up, and it would just really mess with you. And since then, other scientists who've repeated this experiment, but here's what they always find is, you might guess, it's pretty uncomfortable at first, like it's really disorienting, and it feels really unnatural to look at everything upside down. But surprisingly, after a few weeks, your brain, your mind begins to adjust to these lenses. And so these scientists, they've been able to learn to read and write while looking at everything upside down. One guy actually learned to ride a bike with these lenses on, seeing things upside down. And eventually your brain adjusts to these lenses, apparently. Well, as we've been kind of studying through this Matthew 5, 6, and 7, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, this is really what we're kind of being asked to do. We're being asked to look at the world and look at a different set of lenses than maybe we're used to. And so Jesus comes along in the Sermon on the Mount, and he kind of turns a lot of things upside down, things that we've been used to thinking of in terms of one way, kind of flips those around. And so what we're kind of finding out is that oftentimes, perhaps, for example, God's plan, God's game plan, what God wants for our lives, sometimes isn't and is often kind of contradictory to what we think that the good life is, the American dream. Sometimes they're sort of in conflict. And so sometimes things seem pretty upside down, pretty unnatural. And that certainly is going to be true with today. So in Matthew chapter 5, we're going to pick up in verse 38 in just a moment, but Jesus is going to talk to us about how to deal with difficult people. And so maybe you have one or two difficult peoples in your life. This is going to be something that you're going to be able to learn from. And so this is continuing this teaching. And Jesus, again, uses this phrase 6 or 7 times. You have heard it said. You have heard it said. And then he quotes something from the Old Testament, from the Torah. You've heard it said, and then he quotes some widely held truth that people thought was just kind of commonly accepted, common knowledge. And he doesn't contradict it, but then what he does is he clarifies it. Jesus said, I haven't come to abolish the law. I haven't come to abolish the Old Testament, but I've come to fulfill it. And so what he does is he gives us the deeper meaning of these things. And so there's this recognition about certain things. And so he said, you've heard that it was said, like your parents may have said this to you. Or maybe your guidance counselor explained it this way. Or maybe the church you grew up in said it this way or said this. Or maybe that Netflix series you're binge watching during the snow, it gets you to think about things a certain way. You've heard some things, but then Jesus says, but I tell you. You've heard this, but I tell you this. Here's a different way, says Jesus, to look at things. And it's hard because we've been looking at through certain lenses for a long time, and it's kind of natural to us. And Jesus is saying, here's a way to look at some things, and it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's going to be counterintuitive. But here's really what you want to know, that after a while, if you do this, it won't seem unnatural at all, but it will seem natural. And so just kind of as we go through this, I understand that it'll feel a little upside down. But if we will align our lives with what Jesus is going to talk to us about, a couple things are likely to happen. And one of those things is that it will bless your life. That's how the Sermon on the Mount begins. Remember way back in chapter 5, blessed are those, or happy are those. Everybody I know wants to be happy. Everybody I know wants to be blessed. And so if we treat people the way Jesus is going to challenge us to treat people, then we will find greater happiness in our relationships. And it might not seem like it at first, but it will. In fact, what he's going to tell us is the opposite of what we think will bring happiness. We think of difficult people in our life and we think, I'm going to be miserable. I'm going to be miserable as long as that person is in my circle, as long as that person is my boss, or as long as that neighbor is my neighbor, as long as that spouse is my spouse, as long as this person is in my space, I'm not going to be happy. But Jesus is going to give us a path of happiness to deal with difficult people. The second thing that's going to happen is that you will make a difference in this world for the kingdom of God. Like if we do what Jesus tells us to do, we will make a difference in the world for the kingdom of God. You will have an impact. And everybody that I know wants to be happy. Everybody I know wants to make some sort of difference in their lives. And that's kind of the way God wired us. And so in chapter 5, verse 13, Jesus says to his followers, you are the light of the world. He says, you are the salt of the earth. And salt back then, you might know, it had a number of purposes. It was used to preserve food primarily, but it was also commonly used, salt was, as we use it today, as something that you put on your food, regardless of whether somebody tells you, well, I already salted that. Before you taste your food, you're meant to put the salt on the food. And I think you would all agree with me that there are some things that just are not right without putting salt on them. Like baked potatoes, you got to put butter and salt on those. And certainly popcorn. Like if you don't put butter and salt on your popcorn, like there's something wrong with you. It's wrong. It's weird. It's probably immoral. I don't know. It's in the Bible there somewhere, but there's something wrong with you. Everybody ought to put salt on their popcorn. But for us as a church, if we're to be called the salt, then the way that we treat people has to improve their lives, has to make them better. And so we need to be the salt. Philip Keller in his book wrote a book years ago called Salt for Society. And this is what he writes. He says, in Jesus' day, salt was without a doubt the most important element in the culture of his contemporaries. He says that salt is never supposed to just lie on the surface, but it's meant to permeate and to penetrate the food. And he talks about 7 main functions of salt: maintaining health, preserving, seasoning, healing, meeting livestock needs, symbolizing loyalty, offering sacrifice. In fact, back in that day and time, many societies regarded salt as more valuable than gold. This was a very, very valuable thing. And Jesus tells us, hey, you are to be the salt in the world right now. And you will bless the lives of other people if you do that. So we're going to jump right into verse 38. And I want you, as we prepare to look at this verse, I want you just to kind of get in your mind, all right, a difficult person in your life. Now here's the thing. For most of you, it won't take very long, and you probably have a person in mind right now, but don't look at them, don't point at them. If that person is sitting next to you, don't make eye contact, just kind of look straight ahead. But think of a person in your life that is just kind of hard sometimes for you to deal with. It could be a demanding boss. Could be a controlling spouse or an ungrateful child. Maybe it's a selfish friend or somebody who's judgmental or self-righteous. Maybe a sibling or a coworker. How do you respond when somebody betrays you, rejects you, ridicules you, provokes you, takes advantage of you? How do you respond when somebody maybe they just make fun of you? And so in verse 38, Jesus says, "You have heard. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth." See, we have heard that. I've heard that. And frankly, I like that. I like that concept. If you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. Now, I may not hit you first, but I'll return the hit. I may not start this thing, but I'm going to end it, right? If you yell at me, I'm going to yell back. I'm not going to yell first. But if you start it, I'm eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. There's just something within us that says that is fair. That is fair. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Well, Jesus here is referencing, again, a common Old Testament law, eye for an eye, and the thought of it is here that it's exact retribution. That's the idea, that it addresses injustices and slights and offenses in a way that people will be discouraged from taking advantage. It kind of makes sure that things don't just kind of turn into a Hatfield and McCoy scene where everybody just keeps escalating the conflict. Exact retribution, eye for an eye, means the punishment has to fit the crime. No more and no less. You say, well, I like that. That seems to be the way it ought to be. But then Jesus says, but I tell you, don't resist an evil person. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, it gives us 4 different scenarios to help paint a picture of what that looks like to live life this way, to not resist an evil person. Somebody whose mission in life, it seems, is to make your life miserable. Here's what I want you to do, he says. So the first scenario says in verse 39, hey, if this evil person, if they slap you on your right cheek, turn to them the other cheek as well. In other words, don't retaliate. Don't retaliate. You've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. But now I'm telling you, if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, with every one of these things, and with really the whole Bible, we've got to understand what the context is here, because this concept has been mangled a lot. So here's the important thing to take into consideration. Listen to me very well. This is not talking about if you are being abused or just beat up physically, that you need to stay there and just keep taking it and just keep taking it. This passage isn't for the abused spouse, or if you're in a relationship where you are being abused physically, emotionally, whatever it might be, you do not stay in that relationship. You leave, you get help. If you're a kid at school and you're being bullied, don't let yourself just continue to be bullied, but you need to tell somebody in authority. Jesus isn't really talking about that here. What he's talking about are the everyday things that people do to us and say to us that just really get our blood boiling. And he says, don't retaliate. In fact, here's the deal. Like, the fact that he says right cheek is significant. If somebody slaps you on your right cheek, what does that more than likely mean, right? It means that they're backhanding you, right? I guess you could do that, but it's really talking about they're backhanding you. And what that really signifies is not primarily physical assault, but really we're talking about somebody, what's the word I'm looking for? Insulting, thank you, yes, insulting. Congregation participation time. That's really what it's talking about. It's talking about somebody that insults you. It's not really physical violence or damage, but it's somebody that insults you. And in fact, there was actually a different penalty in the Old Testament for somebody slapping you with the back of a hand compared to somebody slapping you with a forehand. And so Jesus says, hey, listen, if somebody comes along and they insult you, maybe they treat you with disrespect, your first instinct is going to be to retaliate, because that's the way we've been living, eye for an eye. He says, but I tell you, turn the other cheek. So who do you have like this in your life? Somebody, maybe they have it out for you for whatever reason. Maybe somebody at work who's always provoking you. Maybe it's a family member. The minute they walk into the room, they're antagonizing you. And when you see them coming, you immediately, you get into fight or flight mode. You ready to go? Let's go. Let's go for it, right? What would happen if you had a different spirit? And now we're not talking, going way back to the first message, we're not talking about weakness. We're talking about meekness. And remember, we said that when Jesus said, blessed are the meek, we're talking about power that is under control for a greater good. We're not talking about just being somebody's doormat. But it's upside down. It does not come natural to us. We want to return insult for insult, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. But Jesus says, if you do this, it will bless your life. The other person will notice. They might not seem like it, but they'll notice, and it will most of all make God look good. Another scenario he says in verse 40. All right, so if anybody wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Hand over your coat as well. You say, well, wait a minute. Jesus okay, if I'm to turn the other cheek and not retaliate, I'm okay with that. I get that. I think I can do that. But here you're saying, if somebody sues me, not only do I have to give them what they're suing me for, but now I've got to take off my coat, put it in a nice little gift bag. Is that how we're operating now? I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. So again, the context. So what did it mean in this day? Well, in those days, people had very simple garments. They would have had, for example, probably several shirts, but people would have only had one coat or one cloak. And they would use that coat at night as a blanket. And there was really no circumstance in which somebody could legally take that cloak, that coat from you. In fact, in Exodus 22, talks about the fact that everybody essentially has a right to a coat. And if you sue somebody, you cannot sue them for their coat. It is their right to own that and to have that. And Jesus here is saying, well, sometimes following me means letting go of your rights. Well, you say, I could do that for somebody that I love. I could give somebody I love a coat. I would do that. I'd be willing to give my blanket for somebody so that they're not cold. If it's somebody I like, somebody who's done something nice for me, but a person who is suing me, no, that's not how it works. I've watched enough Judge Judy. I know my rights. I know how this works. I'm not going to do that. I'm certainly not going to clean it before I give it to him. That is not going to happen, right? Jesus says, hey, listen, let go of our preoccupation with rights. Now, he was writing this 2,000 years roughly before our country came about, which is founded on personal rights. And by and large, that's not a bad thing. See, but we're citizens of a higher kingdom as well that talks a lot about, hey, maybe we need to not be so concerned about our rights. And Jesus says, hey, if you live in the upside down kingdom, sometimes this is what you need to do. Scenario number 3 says, now, if anybody forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. And we've heard this has become a cliche. Hey, he really went the extra mile with me. He really put forth a lot of effort with me. Well, it comes from the Bible in verse 41 here. And the problem I have with this scenario, and maybe you do too, is this word forces. If somebody forces you to go 1 mile with them, go 2. If somebody asked me to go 1 mile, I might do that. I might not feel like it. But I'll go a mile with you if you ask me to go a mile. But the minute that you feel forced to do something, none of us like to be forced to do something. Our pride kicks in and we get angry because we feel like somebody is trying to control us. And so again, what is the context of him saying this? Well, the situation back then in Jesus' day was that a Roman soldier could at any time just tap a Jewish person and say, hey, Jew, carry my pack a mile. See, they looked down upon the Jews. They kind of regarded the Jews as almost being like animals. And so a Jewish person really didn't have an option. It was just kind of the part of the deal of them living there. And so what they would do is they would have to pick up the soldier's pack and they'd carry that a mile. But there were essentially along the roads, there were mile markers, so to speak, in the roads in Jerusalem. And so once they got to that mile marker, the Jew would drop that pack, and then they would go home. They didn't have to go another mile. Legally, they did not have to do that, and the Roman soldier could not make them do that. And so Jesus is saying, hey, listen, like to the people that were dealing with this, right? Hey, if this person, this soldier, or whoever is in authority over you, the person that looks down on you, maybe they're demeaning towards you, maybe they're antagonistic towards you, if they say, hey, you have to go a mile, when you get to that mile marker, then why don't you just choose to go another mile? Like they're not forcing you, they can't, but why don't you choose that? See, well, who does that? Well, nobody, really. And that's kind of the point, isn't it? That people start to notice when somebody does something like that, something that they don't have to do. It's different than the way everybody else lives. And so imagine the scenario. Maybe you're on your way home from work, and you're a Jewish person in the first century, and you're tired and you're hungry, and you just want to go home. And the soldier says, hey, Jew, take this a mile. And you're angry and you're muttering underneath your breath every step of the way. And then you get to that mile marker and you drop the pack and you're still fuming, and you go home and you slam the door and you yell at your spouse and you kick the cat. And because when people are demanding and controlling with you, right? Like this is how we tend to be with other people. Like I know it's not always that way, but when people tend to treat us one way, and they do it enough, that kind of tends to become the way that we treat people in our lives. But what would happen? What would happen in that scenario if you chose to go that second mile? Well, probably what would happen is that it would bless your life. Suddenly you're not doing something that somebody is forcing you to do. You're not going home, then taking it out on other people. And so if somebody insults you or if somebody criticizes you, say something nice to them. If your spouse criticizes you, compliment them. If somebody blames you, bless them. If your server messes up your order in the restaurant, give a more generous tip than you would have given them had they gotten their order right. And people notice that. If that boss is especially grumpy, you pray for the boss and then drop a note of encouragement on the boss's desk. Go that second mile. You don't have to. Nobody's going to force you. But that's really where change happens. And change not just primarily with the person that we're trying to affect, but more importantly, change within us. It blesses our lives. It makes God look good when we don't take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, the fourth scenario in verse 42 says, give to the one who asks you and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. And this is pretty clear. All of us probably at one time or another have had people like this in their lives, like they're always taking something from you. Maybe it's not money, but they're just kind of a drain. And when you see them coming, you know that they're going to want something from you. They're going to be needy. And so how do you respond to that? And I think really this is where it gets kind of messy from my perspective, because up until now, I don't like in my human flesh, I don't like any of these things these new upside down rules that Jesus is laying down, but I'll do it. Because now I know that's what Jesus wants me to do. If somebody slaps me or insults me, I'm not going to slap them back. I may want to. But if you tell me to, Jesus, I won't do that. Or if somebody sues me, I don't like the idea of giving my coat to that person, but I'll do it. Again, I'm not going to wash it first. Don't get crazy. But I'm going to have an attitude, but I'll do it, right? Well, it's hard to live this out. And so what happens is that we have this internal battle between sort of how most of us have lived our entire lives, because this is just kind of the culture, the air we breathe into, to don't let anybody take advantage of you. Stick up for your rights, and don't be a patsy and all these things. And yet there's this competing loyalty for another kingdom that we live in. And it seems like they're always battling. So Jesus says in Verse 46, listen, if you love those people who love you, what reward will you get? Don't even the tax collectors do that. And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than any others? Don't even the pagans do that. And I think we understand what he's saying here. Look, if you love people who love you, that doesn't take any Holy Spirit power. That's just kind of, that comes natural. If you pray for people who only for people who pray for you, if you bless people, the only people who bless you. But when you pray for the person who curses you, when you try your best to love with the power of God, try your best to love that person that is so unlovable in your life, like that is different. And things change, and you change, and God is glorified. And the kingdom of God for a little part of time becomes closer to the kingdom of this world that we live in, because we have brought a little bit of heaven down with us. And I think this is so crucial that we understand this, that we are to love everybody, even people that we disagree with, and for good reason, over the most sometimes important things. We might disagree with them. I don't care what the issue is. We're to love them. And friends, we've got to just get this in our minds that in this world, some Christians treat this world as a battlefield. Like we're in battle against other flesh and blood people. But that's not the case. This world is a mission field. And on mission fields, we're called to love each other, even people who do not love us, even people that we disagree with, even people maybe that don't put salt on their popcorn. I'm going to have to consult the Bible more on that. But we love people. So like kind of an obvious flesh and blood example of this, just kind of celebrated this day. It's a national holiday in our country now. But in 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. was a 20-something-year-old Baptist preacher in Montgomery, Alabama. And one night, late at night, he and his wife and his 2-month-old daughter were asleep in the other room when his phone rang. Well, he picked it up. I'm not going to tell you what the person on the other line said, but suffice it to say that they were threatening his life. Said that he had 3 days to move out, to get out of town, or they were going to kill him. They were going to kill his family. Martin Luther King Jr. hung up the phone. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, and he sat down at the table, and he was angry, and he was mad. They had threatened him. They had threatened his family, and he was scared. I would have been. And so he began to pray. And by the time he was done praying that night, he knew 2 things for sure. Number 1, he knew that God was with him. God was with him, kind of like that passage that Jay referred to earlier, that God was with him and would not leave him. And number 2, he knew right away what his message needed to be. 4 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. is speaking at a rally. About 9 p.m., a young man runs into the service and goes up to Martin Luther King Jr. and announces that King's house has just been bombed. Well, his wife and his little baby were still there. And so he goes running back to his house. And after he discovered that his wife and his daughter were okay, he goes out to his porch. And the police were there. And there was this large, angry mob of black citizens that gathered. They had, baseball bats and weapons. And I'm sure there were probably some guns there. And they were ready to rise up and to riot. This was their leader. Like they had done this horrible thing. But once King got there, again, he made sure his wife and daughter were safe. Then he walked up to the front porch of his home and he began to preach with his home on fire behind him. And so what kind of sermon do you think that he's going to preach? He says, I want you to love your enemies. We need to be good to our enemies. We need to love our enemies. And you need to let them know that you love them. What we are doing is right. What we are doing is just. And God is with us. But we need to love our enemies. And so he says, I want you to go home with glowing faith, with love in your hearts, and with faith and with God in front. He said, and we cannot lose God on our side. And then this what was an angry mob spontaneously breaks out singing Amazing Grace. And they sing and they cry and they hug and they pray, and then they peacefully go to their own homes. And all throughout Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, he had various people telling him, no, that's not the way. Like, change is not going to happen by doing that. But he was like, this is the upside down way that Jesus tells us to do it. It'll never work. You got to get violent. You got to get violent. No, we need to love people. We need to love them, even if that means that we get hurt, that we get harmed. And that's what he did. Now that, I don't think anybody would say, well, he was just a weak person. No, that's not weakness, that's meekness, that's strong, that's strength, that's power under control to serve a greater good. And this is how God changes the world. Sometimes we'll have enemies not because we did something wrong. Sometimes we'll have enemies as God's people simply because we are doing things right. Sometimes we'll have enemies not because we did something wrong, but because we took a chance and stood up for something that's right. And I gotta be honest with you, I'm so, kind of, this is one of the reasons why you saw the slide earlier. I'm gonna do this little series about 3 weeks. We're gonna be talking about screen time and just about the effect that technology and social media has on our minds, on our lives. And trust me, this is not gonna be a 3-week, Chris is gonna rant against everything like that. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna seriously consider, like, how does this shape us as people? How does this shape us as people of God? And I got to be honest with you, I just get so discouraged and frankly sometimes embarrassed. Like on social media when I see people who are followers of Christ and they put stuff on there and like they're stating their views and they have a right to do that, I guess. But again, we hold to a higher right from another kingdom. We're called to stand up for what's right. But those who see things differently, those who oppose us, they're not our enemies. They're not. And so in this world, we don't meet those who oppose us or hate us again on a battlefield, but on a mission field. And for so long, Christians have just kind of forgotten this. Paul says our struggle isn't against flesh and blood, but it's against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms. Therefore, he says, how do we fight this battle? We put on the belt of truth and the breastplate of righteousness. This is how we fight this battle that's not against flesh and blood. It's a spiritual battle. And so Paul says, look, we don't wage war as the world does. That's not how we do it. The world yells and curses and mocks and tries to get the upper hand and is demeaning and self-righteous and hateful. We don't do that, says Paul. We pray, we bless, we serve, we love, we speak with grace and truth. And then we ask forgiveness of God and anybody else we need to when we too often, as we do, fail to do that. But this is how Jesus did it. This is how Jesus called us to live. This is how Jesus called us to love. And so Jesus is falsely accused many times in his life. At the very end of his life, as we're going to be kind of tracing the steps in the series leading up to Easter, Via Crucis, we see that Jesus is beaten, he's mocked, he's blindfolded, they slap him, they spit in his face, they spit in the face of the Son of God. Seriously, do you know who he is, people? With one word, all of heaven's armies could have come and just destroyed every single one of those people. And yet he didn't do that. With a nod of his head, with a bat of his eyelash, he could have paralyzed them all. He could have vaporized them all. But he doesn't do that. What does he do? Well, he prays. He says, Father, forgive them. And that's what we're to do. We're not to return evil for evil. It's not easy. It's upside down. It doesn't seem natural. It totally seems like something that, well, who can really do that? Well, we can with the power of God in our lives because that's what Jesus did. And people in far worse situations than you and I have been able to do the same thing under the power of God. And that's what we're called to do.